Chapter 10, November 18th to 19th, 1863. The same pale evening star that Abraham had almost wished upon shone down on the train station as the 4-car special from Washington arrived in Gettysburg just after sundown. Steam rose around the president's car that was brightly decorated with red, white, and blue bunting. Mr. Lincoln and the dignitaries who'd come with him stepped from the train to the platform and were surrounded by the crowd. Dressed in black, the president stood taller than anyone else, his angular figure rising like a lighthouse above the waves. A brass band struck up a march as he was ushered to the carriage that would take him to the Wills residence. The town was filled to overflowing with people who'd come for the dedication ceremony. Military bands played and street musicians brightened every corner. When he reached the Wills house, Mr. Lincoln was surrounded by a group of serenaders who'd stopped him on the front porch. Unwilling to make a speech before he'd had time to greet his hosts, the president nevertheless said a few words to the crowd.
In my position, it is sometimes important that I should not say foolish things.
Then, from the back of the crowd, someone said,
"If you can help it."
The president smiled. His dark, craggy face brightened as though a lamp had been lit behind his eyes.
"It very often happens that the only way to help is to say nothing at all. Believing that is my present condition this evening, I must beg of you to excuse me from addressing you further."
Inside, Mr. and Mrs. Wills waited anxiously for Mr. Lincoln. Everything had been planned down to the last detail. Lady Smith had been promised that she would be able to greet the president, and she had been waiting for him for what seemed like hours. But as is usual when things are too planned, nothing worked the way it was supposed to. Mr. Edward Everett and Governor Curtin, who'd been invited to dine with the president, arrived by carriage and were shown into the house. Then the other dignitaries showed up, and in no time the house was filled with people milling about, greeting one another as politicians will. Lady Smith found herself surrounded by big men in tuxedos who looked like so many penguins. She began to feel too warm. The scent of flowers and the smell of food caught in her throat. Suddenly she felt sick. Threading her way through the hall, she ran through the kitchen where strangers were preparing food, out the back door and into the garden, where she threw up in the hedge. Her mother found her there and took her home. In the Wills' dining room, the table was beautifully set with fine china and silver. Crystal vases were filled with scarlet hothouse roses and fragrant white lilies. The floors had been polished until they shone with reflected firelight. When he entered the dining room, Mr. Lincoln went over to the fireplace where Abraham's apple wood was burning cheerily.
"I love an open fire,"
he told David Wills.
"I always had one at home."
After dinner and then talk around the table, Mr. Lincoln excused himself and gathered up his papers. Taking a copy of his speech for the following day, he went next door to meet with Secretary of State William Henry Seward, who'd come with him from Washington. When he returned to the house about midnight, he went up to bed. From down in the hollow, Abraham watched Mr. Lincoln's light. The next morning dawned cool and a bit overcast. Crowds gathered to await the arrival of the president for the march to Cemetery Hill. Some said more than 20,000 people had come for the dedication. Marching in the parade were members of the Union Army and Navy, a regiment of troops, hospital corps, military bands, Knights Templars, Masonic fraternity, and other civilian organizations, the fire department, many dignitaries, and the press. Abraham started out early to find the hospital corps, but the crowds were so large that he lost his bearings. Bands played military music, hawkers sold toffee and souvenirs, and all around him was a sea of people. He stopped close to a snake rail fence and stood up in the wagon to get a better look. Nearby, a group of men in fine blue uniforms of the Union Army waited to join the parade. Their horses, thoroughbreds all, were skittish and hard to hold. One officer, on an Arabian stallion that pranced nervously, looked over at Abraham and his mule. He said something to his friend, who laughed and turned to look.
"Looks to me like the bottom rail doesn't know it belongs on the bottom," he said scornfully. "Old man, you'd best get to the end of the parade or back where you came from. You and that sorry-looking mule don't belong here."
But Abraham just turned away. He discovered early on that some folks was prejudice, no matter what part of the country they came from, and that people were either kind or they were not.
"It don't matter what some folks say,"
he said softly, rubbing Charity's long ears.
"We earn the right to be here, and we're going to see President Lincoln and listen to the speechifying no matter what."
Just then, a ripple of excitement passed through the crowd. Off in the distance, President Lincoln was coming up the road riding a beautiful chestnut horse that was reportedly the largest in the Cumberland Valley. In his black suit, stovepipe hat, and white gloves, the president appeared larger than life. The parade only took 15 minutes to reach Cemetery Hill. It was 11 o'clock, but Mr. Everett had not yet arrived, so the bands played and choirs sang, and the crowd milled about until noon. Abraham and Charity went over to a small copse of trees to wait for the ceremony to begin. Beyond were the meadows, the orchards, and in the distance, wheat fields. Then Mr. Everett arrived, shook hands with the president, and greeted the other dignitaries on the platform. The U.S. House chaplain, the Reverend Thomas Stockton, offered a prayer. Mr. Everett was introduced. He rose, bowed to Mr. Lincoln, saying, "Mr. President." Mr. Lincoln responded, "Mr. Everett?" Then, after gazing out over the fields and the crowd, Mr. Everett began. "As my eye ranges over the fields whose sods were so lately moistened by the blood of gallant and loyal men, I feel as never before how truly it was said of old that it is sweet and becoming to die for one's country." He then gave an outline of how the war began and talked about the 3-day battle at Gettysburg. All told, he spoke for 2 hours, which was not unusual in those days. Ending his speech, he said, "In the glorious annals of our common country, there will be no brighter page than that which relates to the Battle of Gettysburg." Applause, sounding like pebbles thrown against a window pane, woke Abraham, who had begun to doze. Then the Baltimore Glee Club sang a song written for the occasion. In the brief silence that followed, Abraham watched as Mr. Lincoln stood up, walked to the podium, took a paper from his coat pocket, and put on his steel-rimmed glasses. The breeze freshened, scattering fallen leaves over the ground and lifting a dark strand of Mr. Lincoln's hair. Abraham cupped one hand behind his ear so as not to miss a single word.
77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men living and dead who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
Mr. Lincoln's final words soared on the waiting air like a dove sent out over water to find land. There followed a kind of hush, a hesitation, as though people weren't sure that the president had actually finished. He had spoken less than 2 minutes. Then there was a smattering of formal applause. A photographer who'd waited nearby to take the president's picture was caught off guard. The speech was over and he was still trying to set up his camera. There was much milling about as reporters and well-wishers thronged the platform. Abraham had trouble seeing through the mist of tears in his eyes and soon lost the sight of Mr. Lincoln. "We might as well go on home now, Charity," he said. I 'spect it's all over but the shouting." Charity hung her head down low, the way she had during battle, as though she carried the weight of the world on her back. Just then, a tall figure moved away from the crowd and out toward the small copse of trees where Abraham stood. Blinking away his tears, Abraham whispered, "Charity, that's Mr. Lincoln, and he's coming this way." He smoothed his ragged coat with trembling hands. When he reached Abraham, Mr. Lincoln held out his hand. For a moment, Abraham was amazed. Then, trembling, he held out his own hand to the President of the United States. "Abraham Small," he said, "free man."
"I saw you out here away from the crowd," said Mr. Lincoln. "I'd like to visit the battlefield before I have to leave Gettysburg, and I'd consider it a kindness if you'd let me borrow your mule."
Abraham bent his neck back to look up at the President, and when Mr. Lincoln looked down at him, Abraham saw the great sadness in his eyes. "We'd be proud," he replied. Mr. Lincoln stepped up onto the seat of the wagon. Then, with a slow, steady gait, Charity once again trod the same sad field she'd walked during the battle. Abraham could scarcely believe that the President of the United States was sitting right next to him in his wagon. Then Mr. Lincoln said,
"I'd like to know what you thought about the speech."
Abraham swallowed past the lump in his throat. "It was mighty fine," he said finally. Mr. Lincoln nodded.
"I'm pleased to hear it,"
he said. Then Mr. Lincoln asked politely how Abraham came to be there, and Abraham somehow found the courage to actually talk to the President, to tell him about how he drove an ambulance during the battle there. He explained how Charity had carried the wounded from the battleground, and how brave and faithful she'd been, how she'd found the injured and had brought them back for healing. The President listened intently. Then Abraham told him about Lamar and how he'd come to meet him, and how he and Charity had come to save him. "I know I'm supposed to hate him, but even if I hated what he stood for, I couldn't hate Lamar. Somehow, I just couldn't view him as my enemy." Mr. Lincoln gazed around the sere brown earth. Then he put his big, bony hand on Abraham's arm.
"There should be no enemies in this place,"
he said, quoting a wounded soldier he'd spoken with in a Confederate hospital after the battle at Antietam. A moment later, they reached their destination. "Whoa," said Abraham softly. Charity stopped. Mr. Lincoln took off his gloves and put them into his hat, which he left on the seat.
"I won't be long," he said, climbing down. "I need to pay my respects."
He walked slowly across the field. His tall, gaunt figure stood out in that place where the trees made no shadows and the earth was torn from battle. Suddenly the President dropped to the earth. The whole length of Abraham Lincoln lay stretched out on the cold ground. His great hooded eyelids shut out the pale November sky. He took a deep, shuddering breath. Charity went over to him. She searched out the wounded many times. She nuzzled his neck, looking for warm breath. Mr. Lincoln opened his eyes and said, "Not to fear, old girl. I'm not hurt. Only my heart is wounded." Then he rose, brushed the dead grass from his suit, and climbed back up into the wagon. They rode on for a while in silence. An icy wind blew across the fields. Looking at Charity, Abraham decided that the next money he got his hands on, he'd buy her a thicker blanket for the winter.
"It's getting colder," said the President, putting on his gloves. "Don't you have a hat?"
Abraham replied, "No, sir, not at this time I don't."
"Here," said Mr. Lincoln, "take mine."
Abraham accepted the gift graciously. He placed the hat on his head and turned to the President.
"Very fine,"
said Mr. Lincoln. At the entrance to the cemetery, a throng of people waited. No one was quite sure where the President was, but they weren't expecting to see him in a mule-drawn wagon, so that he was upon them before they realized it. A light cry came from a corner, where a group of women and children waited together. "Charity!" cried Lady Smith, squeezing past the lady's black hoop skirts. She'd missed the President the night before. She didn't intend to miss him again. "Stop! Wait for me!" And Charity did, waiting as the small girl in the lilac dress made her way through the crowd and over to the wagon. Abraham lifted her up onto the seat, and the President turned to her. "Mr. President," she said, offering him her bouquet, "I brought you rosebuds."
"You're a precious rosebud yourself,"
he said, hugging her. A moment later, he handed her back down to her mother, who stood at the crowd's edge. It was nearly dusk when they reached town. The Wills' house was bright with candlelight. Out front, a number of admirers had gathered to bid the President farewell. The same group of men who had made fun of Abraham and Charity earlier were also there, waiting to escort the President to the train station. Mr. Lincoln stepped down from the wagon, and after bidding Abraham farewell, patted Charity on the head.
"You're a fine mule," he said. "A mighty fine mule."
Then he was swallowed up in the crowd. Abraham watched as the men on horseback maneuvered for places near the president's carriage. As he passed them on his way home, Abraham smiled and tipped his new hat to them.
"Looks like the bottom rail's on the top now," he said politely.